Okay, so first and foremost, thank you for everyone for attending. I really enjoy speaking about this topic. We're going to talk about why transparency makes for better science today, and ultimately the application of that in a few different specific areas using a publication that our lab published this past year, and kind of the journey of that publication, and ultimately what we learned throughout that process, and what I think it can help us do in terms of making our research and our science better. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. So very quick introduction of who I am. Courtney already mentioned it, and this is the least interesting part of all discussions, but I'm a postdoc at the FAU Skeletal Muscle Physiology Lab. My research for my PhD focused on investigating response heterogeneity in the context of resistance exercise. And I've been kind of introduced to open science practices for about 5 years. I've had some really, really awesome mentors, one of which is Dr. Zordos, as Courtney already mentioned, who have kind of brought these issues to the forefront and something that I have become more interested in throughout my PhD and now into my postdoc. And then there's my email if anyone has further up questions. I can pull that up again at the end. Okay, so just a quick outline of kind of how today's discussion is going to work. So for the very first part, I have to be the bad guy. I have to kind of tear down this kind of image of what we think about academia and what we think about science. There's some unfortunate realities that kind of come when we really peel back the layers on that process and help us understand how to move forward. Then we'll talk about some principles of open science and specifically make the case for why preprints, I think, can improve the scientific process for a variety of different areas. Finally, we'll wrap up with that real world example that I mentioned from one of our experiences from our lab from this past year, and then wrap it up with some takeaways. Okay, so to start, something I'm going to call the ivory tower mirage. So if anyone's ever kind of thought about or heard about things that academia is kind of referred to as, you may have heard the kind of the slogan of the ivory tower. I'm going to use a different kind of example to kind of talk about this that hopefully communicates a similar idea, and it's the movie of The Wizard of Oz. So for anybody that's not familiar, we have these individuals that are going on this journey to the Emerald City. That's this big mystical magical place that's ruled by the Wizard of Oz, who is an extremely powerful and capable ruler that has powers that they seek, that ultimately is going to help them on their individual journeys. And so they travel down the yellow brick road to try to ultimately get to the Emerald City to seek this Wizard of Oz's power. Similarly, in the context of academia, we have all of us, lovers of science, people who either are participating directly through research or teachers or what have you, or even people just that appreciate the scientific method and what it can do for us practically. And we have this academic dream where all of these principles are upheld and ultimately manifested into the work that we do. These are things like rigorous peer review, the elimination of bias, very, very accessible resources to everyone involved, total transparency throughout that process, reproducibility of those results, and ultimately science being a self-correcting process. These are all foundational principles of the scientific process that we all hope that academia and the research that we all do can ultimately uphold. However, if you know the movie The Wizard of Oz, as our individuals ultimately do get to the Emerald City, they get to peel back the curtain and ultimately see what the Wizard of Oz actually is. And it's nothing more than just an individual kind of pulling some levers on the back end. And it's not this grand mystical thing that it really seems to be on the out. And so ultimately, this is similar to some of the realities of the academic research process. If you really peel back the layers, we realize there is inconsistency in peer review. There is things like publication bias. There is very limited accessibility, limited transparency when it comes to the entire research process. We have issues reproducing our results, and it's really difficult to correct. So just to give a few examples of each of these throughout this process, let's start with some of the issues with peer review. So this has been written on a ton, and I'm just pulling out a few different examples that kind of make these points clear. But peer review has been something that's been talked about for a really long time, both in the scientific literature, but also just in kind of the general public. And some of it's ultimately has some flaws. On the bottom left here is an example where they're testing the reproducibility of peer review to see if peer reviewers actually agree on what is appropriate and well-conducted science. And we can see in the highlighted section here that the agreement between reviewers is often not as much better than what we would expect by chance. And then similarly, There's been instances in the British Journal of Sports Medicine when articles have been submitted with intentional errors to see the ability of peer reviewers to actually recover these errors and correct them. Typically, only about 50% of the reviewers actually respond. The average reviewers, average number of errors caught by reviewers is about 2, and then only a few reviewers were able to spot more than 5 errors. And then finally, 35 reviewers or 16% didn't spot any errors. So this is just the tip of the iceberg. But the point of it is, and this is obviously dependent on the field and the quality of peer review that ultimately gets done, and it's a case-by-case basis, but peer review is not without its flaws. And it's not a panacea that I think sometimes the external person viewing the scientific process may sometimes think. Next, we have things like publication bias. And so on the left here, if you've ever looked at a meta-analysis or a collection of studies, this is what's called a funnel plot. And a funnel plot is just essentially plotting all of the data that we have in a given area and viewing that relative to the variance that we would expect for that given effect size. And so ultimately, what these plots can show is something called publication bias. So given the incentives of the publishing process, we often publish positive results or results that find significant findings, and those that don't actually have positive results that appear to have headline grabbing effects kind of get tossed in what's called the file drawer problem, or they become just kind of tossed away and never actually enter the scientific research to begin with. So what this can have individuals chase, whether it's consciously or subconsciously, is they end up doing what's called p-hacking, which is essentially trying to find different ways to analyze their data to find positive results with a greater likelihood that that hard work that they manifested is actually going to find its way into a journal for it to be seen. And so this is kind of pervasive throughout a lot of areas of research. And you can see these dots right here that have the greater probability of being p-hacked because they don't really follow normal laws of distributions that we would expect. And there's a lot of tight clustering around thresholds that would lead to significant results, as we would kind of expect if there is some sort of an incentive to publish positive findings and not publish negative findings. So this is an unfortunate reality that tends to be the case across really large data sets when we're able to investigate it accurately. There does seem to be cases of publication bias that are more prevalent than we would probably want. Additionally, we have accessibility issues, and this is a really popular meme that was kind of poking fun at this kind of quality of science. But we have an article from Nature that talks about the growing inaccessibility of science that is ultimately behind a $9 paywall to be able to actually access the article. Instant facepalm for anyone that's, kind of reading that with open eyes. So that's a pervasive thing that people that actually need to utilize this information ultimately don't have access to it, which is an oxymoron within itself. Then we have issues with transparency. Anyone that has, read a research paper or is trying to go through the data with a fine-tooth comb has probably seen this data availability statement. And I can tell you from firsthand, often, despite this saying we can get the data so we can examine it thoroughly, or maybe we have a question with how something was done or some sort of calculation was performed, unfortunately, these kind of statements really don't mean much. And it's really, really hard to get the actual data or actual information that papers or claims are ultimately based upon if we really want to check something or verify something for ourselves, ultimately leading to this limited transparency that we're ultimately after. In my own field, this has been the cause of multiple kind of cases where data patterns just ultimately seem improbable. And that can lead to distrust, that can lead to questions about the veracity of the research that is performed, and ultimately leave the public or anybody that's viewing this research and trying to put it into practice with a little bit more questions and less trust of the overall findings. Additionally, we have issues with replication. So this is some results from the psychology replication crisis, which, if you've kind of heard about these kind of things, is a pretty popular case study where they essentially took a lot of these foundational experiments in psychology, like the marshmallow experiment you may have heard, among others, and they're ultimately replicating those studies or doing them again to see if they're able to recover the original effect sizes from these studies that got a ton of press. And unfortunately, only about 36 of those studies were actually able to be replicated with similar effect sizes or p-values to the original studies themselves. And this is just continuously pointing to all these sorts of indirect or direct mechanisms that kind of make our scientific literature riddled with some potential bias. And this is something we need to take seriously. And then finally, even if you do identify all of these potential missteps and potential areas to correct, it's really, really challenging to set the record straight in science when errors are identified. In the bottom here, we have a recent article that was examining the effect of cold exposure in a military population. You can see here we have a ton of impressions, a ton of people mentioning the article in blog posts and social media posts and things like this, and the press really get a hold of it, signified by the 871 number here. But this article was retracted for a variety of reasons related to the article with a fraction of the attention for the actual retraction. So the problem is the damage is already done when something is published, even if we are going back to try to set the record straight. And that's what this review paper kind of talks about in the term of trying to correct the scientific literature is often effort that is too little too late. And that's just an unfortunate reality of the way things work and how fire kind of spreads. And so ultimately, the moral of the story here that, again, I hate being the bad guy, but it's important to start on these grounds, is that the reality is the application of the scientific method isn't a perfect process in the way that it's currently done, like we all wish it was. It's not this pure endeavor that derived from the exact scientific method we read in textbooks and apply it in the real world. However, it is absolutely still the best way to grow closer to the truth. We all still respect these scientific principles and their ability to help us gain information and grow closer to the truth. But being aware of these problems and limitations is absolutely crucial to moving forward in the best way. So that's going to bring us to the principles of open science. So ultimately, open science is just about transparency. Open source code and statistical analyses, open methodology that's able to be reproduced exactly by someone else if they wanted to, open peer review to see how things change among the peer review process, open access manuscripts so more individuals are able to read and understand the data that is being in question. Open educational resources or anything utilized throughout the entire study design, whether that's questionnaires, sometimes even videos of certain things in the study design to better verify how a technique was done. And then finally, and probably the most important, is open data that is utilized to create these manuscripts so people can verify things and look at things from different perspectives. And it also allows us for different types of analyses later down the line when a lot of these open data sets are able to be collectivized, meta-analyzed, and looked at in different ways. So again, the point is just increased transparency of the process across the spectrum. And this is kind of the analogy that I like to use for people to kind of get an understanding of like how this would really work. So I use the analogy of like buying a house. So if you're going to buy a house and all you were able to look at was the nice white picket fence on the outside, you're going to have a price in a way that you would go about that negotiation. However, if I told you if you're able to peel the layers back, step inside and realize there was a bunch of damage or mold to the walls, that doesn't make the house not something you would necessarily want to buy still, but it's definitely important information to help you negotiate and buy that at a potentially different price, different value, or it helps you view the entire situation differently because you have more information. And the exact same thing can be said about open science. In the process where all you see is the peer-reviewed manuscript that's made it all the way into the finish line, there's a lot of context that's missing there. You don't have access to the data. You don't have access to the peer review process. What does the manuscript look like before feedback was given? All of these different questions that you could potentially have answers to if more open practices were utilized. Just as an example of some really modern platforms that have kind of put this into action, this is a platform called Octopus, where essentially researchers are able to publish every single increment of the scientific process and allow somebody to follow it from the initial creation of an idea all the way down to articles or blogs where they're actually showing you how to apply this in the real world in an actual applied sense. It's really, really interesting. And this is the type of things that I think things are ultimately headed towards, is that you can, as somebody who's viewing this from an outside perspective, you can see how the rationale was identified. You can see how the methods follow from the rationale, how the results follow from the study methods, any limitations that popped up throughout the process that weren't pre-specified. It just gives you a more holistic understanding of the entire research process for a given area, rather than just seeing the final cut, simplified, summarized results that you'll see in a final manuscript. And this is just kind of in the spirit of open science. And so I could go on and on about the benefits of open science. Obviously, it's greater transparency throughout the research process. It's increased visibility for researchers, both from a perspective of the work being impactful, cited, etc., but also for additional people to give you feedback and different types of experts from different areas that could give you sub feedback on the statistical analysis or the methods, or maybe something else to consider that could be an offshoot project and eventually turn into a collaboration. Ultimately, open science just has all of these downstream benefits that some are really easy to see initially, but there's a ton of downstream ones that have second order consequences as well. And so when we talk about open science, it's a very, very big kind of umbrella term. And I often, when I kind of talk about these things, I don't want people to get intimidated and think, oh, I have to implement all these things overnight. It definitely doesn't have to be that way. And we're just going to pick one thing today to talk about specifically, which is preprints. So preprints are a specific kind of part of the quote unquote open science process, where a preprint is a complete manuscript that is shared with a public audience that has not undergone formal peer review. Sometimes these preprints are just kept on the server and never actually submitted to a scholarly journal. But a lot of times it's kind of a first version of a manuscript that is publicly available that will later be submitted to a traditional scholarly journal. Preprints started in 1991 in physics with a server named arXiv, and now there are a ton of domain-specific derivatives that have kind of popped up since then. So arXiv here again in physics, that we have medRxiv, bioRxiv, chemRxiv, psychRxiv, and sportRxiv, which is the one we often use in my field, which are all kind of the same thing that just house different domains of papers. And so this is ultimately what a preprint kind of looks like on a server. And you'll notice it looks almost identical to a manuscript you may pull up on a journal's website, and that's kind of by intent, except there are some really important changes. First and foremost, obviously it's freely accessible to anyone. It's publicly available, no paywalls. You don't have to have university access to actually download the file. The process is extremely expedient. So within 2 days, most of the time, from submitting the preprint, it'll be up on the server. They're consistently updated. So if you provide an additional version, an amendment, additional materials, you can see over here it has version control that ultimately will tell you what version of the preprint is this, and it documents the entire process. So you can see changes version to version. It's immediately citable. It immediately is given a DOI, just like a paper is, so you can cite it and utilize that as rationale for future work. There's open commentary, which ultimately, a public person or another researcher is able to make a comment on a preprint that's publicly viewed if there's a limitation or some other question about the methods that can be verified. And then ultimately it reduces redundancy by making the process of science a little bit faster, a little bit less lag time. Other researchers are able to keep an eye on this other data that's coming out, potentially modify projects that they had planned, start new collaborations that kind of build off of previous work, or ultimately it just may prevent redundancy in the same idea being done and ultimately allow for collaboration as far as that goes. So while I've been talking about the benefits of these things, obviously there are pros and cons to everything, and there's some common concerns with preprints that I do want to talk about. So the first one is about getting quote unquote scooped. So some concerns about, okay, if I post my manuscript on a preprint server, this is going to lead to someone else stealing my idea when it comes to a formal publication. The reality is for preprints is actually giving you a time-stamped document that you can say, hey, this is something that I had at this specific date. And ultimately, all of the preprint servers kind of talk about the prevalence with this, with their kind of statistics, and they say it's actually less likely to get scooped when you have this timestamps and showing that you have precedent by posting a preprint on a preprint server. The next one is the fact that does this incentivize rush to work in the sense that we're getting work out there and we're not having individuals look at it. In my opinion, this is kind of just helping some of the inherently slow processes of peer review in the journal system. As we talked about, peer review within itself is not a panacea. There are limitations to it. And by having more rapid dissemination of research, I think it's going to far outweigh the cons in terms of the potential for rushed work. And most of the time, in my experience, actually, the additional exposure that you'll get for a publicly available manuscript makes you have a higher attention to detail. You're understanding that anyone can read this, and that's going to force you to make sure your I's are dotted and your T's are crossed. The next one is just how to communicate work that isn't peer reviewed. As we discussed before, communicating all research comes with limitations and comes with caution. And to me, the irony is that preprints giving unlimited access to a number of reviewers that can ultimately view the work and critique it, whereas standard peer review is relegating that responsibility to only 1 to 4 individuals that are able to actually shape the manuscript that ends its way up in a journal. So in my opinion, it isn't peer reviewed, but all manuscripts should be viewed with caution, read with caution, and understand there's limitations to all. Preprints are able to open up that review process to more individuals than just those that are kind of given the formal ability to peer review it. And so to finally end us off here, we're going to talk about a real world example that we kind of talked about in our lab this past year. So this was a big project that we kind of started at the end of my master's degree that this is kind of the final project. We got it published in the Journal of Sports Medicine. And this was on July 6th, 2024, which is a highly cited journal in our field, and we're really, really proud of it. And so I'm just going to take you through the kind of the timeline of how that kind of went. So on March 1st, 2022, roughly, that's when we kind of had the conception of the idea. And then throughout that process, we came up with a first draft in January of 2023, and we were able to publish version 1 of the preprint in May 2023. And that's what you're viewing over here. We published the manuscript to Sport Archive, and that was version 1. In January, then, essentially throughout that time, we were getting community feedback. And so essentially we put this preprint out, it's publicly accessible. Anyone interested in the topic or has expertise in the topic was able to give us feedback. And we ultimately got about 22,000 views on the preprint, which is thousands of eyeballs, and hundreds of individuals reached out to give us direct feedback on how we can make things better or how we could improve it. And so what we did is we took that feedback throughout that period and we ultimately updated the preprint to a second version. And so you can notice down here, we have version control of the preprint, and it's the server is ultimately identifying to somebody who's viewing it that, hey, this is an outdated version, make sure to view the updated version. But that version control allows someone to see the change from version to version. And so ultimately we published that second version on September 18th, 2023, and then we submitted it for formal publication basically the following day. Then we went through the formal kind of publication process with the journal, went from February for the first round of revisions. We got the second round of revisions in June, finally got accepted in late June, and then ultimately the publication was out and publicly available for those with journal access in July in 2024. So as you can see, the preprinting process essentially made our work citable, known, and impactful in about 50% of the time compared to the normal journal-oriented process. And in my opinion, this is my kind of N01 experience, but changes in the community feedback stage were far more substantial than pretty much all of my peer review experiences in the past. Obviously, in this case, it's somewhat confounded that we got the community feedback prior to getting the revision stage with this actual manuscript, but just comparing my experience in peer review versus my experience with community feedback in this case, the community feedback was extremely, extremely useful, targeted, and really helped shape the manuscript into a better version compared to my typical peer review experience, which is often minor changes, some of which are begrudgingly to us as the authors that we feel doesn't necessarily make the paper better, but sometimes you have to do it to get it kind of to the finish line. And so I've done this a lot in kind of our time in the lab, and we've kind of really ramped up the amount of preprints and the open science kind of process that we're trying to commit to. And this kind of tends to be the rule and not the exception with preprints in my experience. Ultimately, it gives people better accessibility, more willing, quote unquote, reviewers or readers of the preprint that's publicly accessible. I think it ultimately leads to higher quality work because you're essentially, again, putting that microscope on something that's entirely publicly available. The amount of people that could give you feedback or the attention that that paper is going to get far exceeds that of 1 to 4 individuals that you'll have in peer review. Fundamentally, I think it can have a larger impact because more people are able to read the work, utilize it for whatever that ends up being. And then all of this is done with faster processes and with more transparency. So from my perspective, it's essentially a win on all fronts. And so finally, for some primary takeaways, I think as it's probably evident at this point, open science practices make our work better. And I think this includes preprints. I think preprints are really a positive step forward in a lot of ways. The second, like I already mentioned, you don't have to commit to an entirely open approach to science overnight. Gradual change is completely acceptable, and honestly, it's more manageable that way to just try to make every project a little bit more open, a little bit more transparent, and just trying to improve things in that way incrementally over time is totally sufficient. And then finally, just in an age of kind of institutional distrust, I think transparency just across the board is kind of our ally to make the work that we do more trustworthy and ultimately more actionable on an individual level. If people have more understanding of how the conclusions were drawn and the transparency throughout the entire process, I think that just makes the work that much more appealing for anyone looking to apply it. And so in the top right corner here, obviously is not peer reviewed, terrible joke. But in my opinion, this is kind of how the process, progress of science in my field has kind of gone with the implementation of open science practices and preprints. Preprints is kind of a stand in here. It's one of many things, including data availability, that kind of contribute to this. But over time, scientific process is going to be kind of this asymptotic relationship. But I genuinely feel the rate at which scientific progress has been made in my own field has accelerated tremendously after having these kind of open science practices for a variety of different reasons, and something I feel strongly about. But yeah, that is pretty much all I have, and I'm more than willing to answer questions related to this topic, related to the paper, what have you.
Thanks, Zach. I really appreciate the kind of, cradle to end. I don't like to use the G word here, but from the inception to how you got to the actual paper. Could you speak a little bit? And I see Christian has his hand up, but before I get to Christian, can you talk about how you made the decision of which comments to accept, or was that made with the group, or were there just some comments that were so completely outlandish you were like, absolutely not, no way?
Yeah, you're definitely going to get pretty much everything in between, whether that's angry Instagram comments all the way up to extremely well-written, well thought out emails from people. I kind of got everywhere across the spectrum for the project that we talked about. And it really is just kind of a kind of case by case basis and evaluating the arguments to see if they're substantive or not. And if they are, and there's something that you should seriously consider and take on board, the argument should be able to stand for itself, kind of regardless who's giving the actual argument. And I think that's kind of a big thing that I'm pretty passionate about, in the sense that I think peer review is kind of sometimes relegated to high and mighty, kind of, we have titles, so we're able to give, and that's obviously a really, really important process to make sure that we have expert opinion that are able to verify the work. But I genuinely think like more people are able to give meaningful feedback, even if it's asking a question that can propagate something to realize, hey, this is not clear, for somebody who's well-meaning trying to read this work with good intentions. So I think it really can come from a variety of sources, in the aspect of direct critiques and making comments directly to say, hey, you can improve this, yada, yada. Or it can come from really well-intentioned questions on someone just trying to understand things and realizing there's a lack of clarity that you're able to clear up just coming from the average person. So I think it really does kind of just span the spectrum.
Great, thank you. Hey, Christian, you want to go ahead and unmute and ask your question?
Thank you. Great work, Zach, as always. I just had one question about sort of the larger scope of all of this. Obviously, this is so much better for scientists in general and getting their work out and getting feedback and all that. I haven't seen this as like a common use sort of in the more like the med school yet. But do you see like larger publishers trying to push back against this as it cuts into like their profits or what have you? Like, do you see anything in the future that in terms of that, or is it leaning more towards the open access?
It's a good question. One that I will very clearly identify. I'm not an expert, not well researched on the uh, implications, both at a institutional level and or economic perspective, on how journals make their money, how that influences the way research is done, and ultimately how that research is, or how that influences the way information is propagated. But I will say that the way in which the journal structures are incentivized and the entire system is set up, I do think that can be improved personally. I think, just as a very basic example on something I feel like is relatively non-controversial from kind of either perspective is that reviewers aren't incentivized in any way. Essentially, it's just kind of paying your dues. And I think in a lot of ways that's just tough to justify. A meaningful amount of time, a meaningful amount of efforts put into actually critiquing manuscripts. And I think that just becomes a really, really challenging equation to kind of get people to do the work that's necessary to really have a high bar and high standard of the work that gets through. So I think that the incentivizing of reviewers in terms of whether that's payment, whether that's something else, I think that's something that's a pretty big problem in terms of the way that the peer review process is currently set up. That said, in terms of other structural ways to improve this process, I'm not entirely sure. I think there obviously will be some pushback from people who are incentivized to continue the kind of the status quo. But I think, throughout the past couple of years in pretty much all fields, this has begun to trend in the right direction. If you kind of go back through the history of preprints specifically, this was really, really pushed back against initially, as far as some of the top journals in certain fields, like outright banning it. Like if a paper was a preprint at any point in time, it would not be accepted or even considered for publication. And those have consistently kind of fallen by the wayside and realizing, I think the NIH was one of the first governmental bodies that kind of put away with that and didn't really take that perspective. So in my opinion, if you zoom out far enough, it's definitely headed in the right direction. As far as how we get there in terms of actual policy and institutional perspective, that is something that's far outside my pay grade.
Thanks, Zach.
Thank- Nancy, I'm going to unmute you. Go ahead and ask your question.
Hi, great presentation. Have had the experience of seeing some of the psych air publications and students who are applying for fellowship. It helps them with their fellowship application. So I think it's actually good. I have two questions. One is not necessarily, somebody stealing your work, but interpreting it correctly, especially when some concepts are not sort of publicly the same in or some of the terminology and public how does that play into whether you accept the comments of the community. And along with that, I just look at the number of comments you had, and I think that's great. But I also would hate to, as a scientist, go through all those comments and sort of weed out the ones that are not valid. And so, is there any sort of like way that you think that the journals or this open science format should make sure that the comments they're getting are good comments, valid comments, and not just, hey, this is stupid or something like that, because I can imagine there's some of those also that people are just criticizing you.
Absolutely. Yeah, some great questions and definitely things to consider. So on the former, I would say that the limitation of people interpreting the work correctly and critically is a limitation of science, and no matter what stage it's at in the process. You can take a peer-reviewed manuscript that's been through the entire formal process, and someone can get their hands on that and butcher it entirely and even misinterpret it, even if they're in the field and they're experts in the field. So in general, I tend to put the onus on the individual interpreting the work and just giving people access to the information, and not assuming that certain groups of people can and cannot interpret the information correctly. That's going to just be such a case-by-case basis. And when in doubt, I'm just going to err on the side of transparency for that reason. Specifically with regard to the comments and kind of weeding through those things, I would say nearly all of the preprint servers that I'm aware of have moderation. So it's essentially just like you said, like weeding through like, hey, this is a substantive scientific point or question and not someone just throwing garbage at you or tomatoes from the peanut gallery on the stage, right? And it depends on what kind of platforms you're looking for feedback on. We casted a really, really wide net, all the way from social media, all the way to like I said, formal comments from peers and emails and on the servers themselves. You don't have to do that. You could cast a narrower net and don't give that opportunity to some individuals. But again, I think it's tough from my perspective, because the more that you narrow that scope of individuals who are able to give feedback, you're kind of making an assumption that they're not able to give meaningful feedback. And in my experience, like I said, even if it's from well-intentioned questions, you can learn a lot from just the average person kind of trying to interpret the work that's interested, more than you might expect. And so finally, just to wrap things up and kind of touch on the first question, maybe from a different angle, is to me, that might be even more of a question about science communication. And that is a really, really important part of this process too. In the octopus kind of timeline that I was showing is kind of a good visualization for this, is that often researchers are, kind of in the lab in writing the papers and not thinking too much about how this is actually communicated to the public. And there's kind of pros and cons to kind of considering that as part of your work and your responsibility. But I genuinely do think at least being aware of that aspect of the equation in terms of, okay, this is rigorous work, it is transparent, it is all done extremely high quality, but how can I make sure that if this does get in the hands of somebody that is just the average person on the public level, they have some tools to interpret it correctly and potentially implement it if that is a topic that is ultimately something an individual could implement. Like the area of research matters here, obviously. But scientific communication is a really, really important part of that process, and giving people the tools that they can hopefully interpret things as correctly as possible is really, really important as part of this equation as well. And I think more modern platforms are kind of starting to acknowledge that, and trying to kind of head that off from the start to make sure people have the tools to hopefully not just wildly misinterpret things and call you names in the spirit of critique.
So we have another question. Someone's raised their hand. I don't know. He looks like a freshman. His name is Michael. I don't even know how he got in here. So Michael, can you ask your question?
Yeah, I'll be brief. I have to go to class in a minute. My professor's going to be very upset. Zach, I guess two quick things. One thing on what you just said in the previous exchange was something that's really valuable is we all have the ability now to communicate science as well. So we all can use social media. We can start podcasts. We can do these things too that other people are doing to critique our work. But I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the value from the open science perspective of pre-registered trials. And whether it's on clinicaltrials.gov, whether it's on the open science framework, especially from the perspective of how that can hold people accountable and also ensure people are running the appropriate statistical analyses based upon what they say in their pre-registration.
Yeah, so that's a really good question. Let me see if I have that on here in terms of one of the main things. Yeah, so this is kind of a graphic again. Try not to get too overwhelmed, but let's start at the top of the dial here, and we're kind of going towards the resourcing and planning part of the stage. And we have pre-registration listed here, is what Dr. Zordas just mentioned. So pre-registration is essentially publishing your study protocol before the study ever begins. And so pre-registration is a really, really important part of kind of the open science framework as well, given that it keeps the entire kind of research pipeline, again, to use that kind of analogy, transparent, and again, holds people accountable, like Dr. Zordo said. So a pre-registration is essentially making someone very, very specifically outline the exact research project that they are entailing to embark on. That comes down to the exact population study, a sample size justification that they're going to shoot for, and specific methods on how they derive that, the exact methods of the study, the exact statistical analysis that they plan to investigate, and any follow-up or potential secondary analyses that they may be interested on the front end. The reason that doing this all ahead of time is so paramount is it's going to help prevent some of these selection bias issues, like we talked about on the kind of the publication bias slide, is by pre-registering your hypotheses, all of the statistical tests that you will run, we're going to make it less likely that people are ultimately subconsciously or consciously falling victim to these mechanisms that somewhat benefit positive results. And this can go even a step further on something called a registered report, whereas you're ultimately actually publishing the pre-registered protocol, and the journal is provisionally accepting the manuscript regardless of the outcome. And so this is something that's really, really cool and starting to gain favor in some of the more kind of medically oriented fields, is that saying if the reviewers agree that our results our methods are sound, and the ability to carry out this trial allows us to identify the research question and answer it robustly, it doesn't matter what the outcome is. The outcome is the outcome. And that is something that is, again, going to help prevent some of these mechanisms that are unfortunately kind of incentivized from the way that publishing has been done in the past. So I think pre-registration just does, again, either subconsciously or consciously kind of holds you to a really, really well thought out research question. And having done a few pre-registrations ourselves, I'm sure Dr. Zordas can agree, having to specify things in the degree of detail that would be necessary for a pre-registration, it makes you think about your research question about 10 times harder, and makes you specify things and think about things that you never would have thought about, having not had that kind of pressure to really lay things out to a really detailed degree, so that the study could be carried out exactly ahead of time. So I think pre-registration absolutely could do a whole nother talk on that, and how important that is, and how useful that is as well. But yeah, I agree 100%.
Do we have other questions for Zach or even Dr. Zordos, since he was an author on this paper as well? But absolutely, this was Zach running with it from beginning to end. So if you have questions on the preprint process, or even the science and meta-analysis that they were doing. So I think, as I'd mentioned earlier, this paper that went through the preprint has actually very high alt metrics. I want to say, what, 740 or something? A lot of hits, a lot of traction on this paper. So I think that just demonstrates the value of doing preprints and having open science and transparency, especially in the light of a report that came out this morning, and I saw Springer Nature actually retracted 2,923 articles that had been published in 2024. They retracted almost 3,000 articles. So having this is certainly important for scientific integrity and data reproducibility. Took a while to get that one out. So we're happy to have more questions for Zach, and like I said, Dr. Zordos, if he's willing to stick around for a sec.
Yeah, also the 26 citations in only a few months of being published. So, my guess is that paper will probably have 100, a little over a year, which is pretty rapid exposure.
And it's also been featured in, MSN, and, different news outlets had picked up this paper as well. So I think that's extraordinarily impressive, for, a group that, maybe doesn't get the recognition that they deserve all the time. And Zach, can you, pardon me, can you tell me, what did you think was the most helpful kind of stage in this entire process that was really the most eye-opening to you, where you went, oh, wow, this is incredible, and we should always do science this way?
Honestly, I think it was just the community feedback process. Like, I knew we'd get some, well-intentioned individuals giving feedback and kind of talking through it, just because I've seen it. And I've given that feedback to other individuals in different cases, just kind of, it's what you do, and it's out there, and it's work that you're involved in. You have colleagues and things like that. But I think just the sheer feedback, like I said, of people from different, parts of the spectrum. Like I said, I think I was extremely, extremely encouraged by the ability of individuals who you would not expect are formally trained to give feedback to give extremely meaningful feedback to the extent that it definitely helps shape the manuscript into a better project at the end stage. And that's really just kind of my general ethos, is that, even if we're talking about a medical trial, there can be questions that an individual can have from reading a study that it doesn't necessarily change the methods. It doesn't necessarily find a flaw in the way that the study was designed. But communication is just as important part of this when it comes to actually implementing the results of different studies and trials to the real world. And if somebody has a question, or if there's hesitancy based on something, the way something was described, the way in which the science is communicated is almost just as important as the actual methods and the results sometimes, particularly for more public-facing research like we do. So I think that's probably just the biggest thing that I learned throughout this process, that I've just continued to carry with me, that essentially all people that are well-intentioned probably can give you feedback, and you can probably learn something from everyone's interpretation of what you did, just in different ways.
Alexandra, do you have a question?
Yes, this is a question for Dr. Robinson. When publishing a preprint of a given paper, does that not increase the chances of the paper being fundamentally misunderstood by folks, especially on the social media space? And as we went over in your presentation, how it's difficult to correct misconceptions once they're sort of out and when they kind of spread like wildfire. What would be your approach when a preprint is just misunderstood on a fundamental level by certain individuals? It gets spread, and then a large majority of the scientific communicators, if you will, do not do a good job in representing a preprint.
Yeah, two things. The first thing is, unfortunately, that's not relegated to preprints. The unfortunate reality is just because there's limited information doesn't mean it's not going to have somebody trying to interpret it and to communicate it. So there's a ton of cases where someone will see the abstract of a study or something that is, they don't have the entire manuscript, they don't have the full text, they don't understand the entire methods, and they're still out there communicating because of some of the incentives of social media. So the first thing is, I don't think that's specific to preprints, and I think that's just a unfortunate reality of the way scientific information is communicated in general. And that's where I think Dr. Zordos makes a really good point, in the sense that I do think it's starting to become more of a responsibility for scientists to be out there to correct the record to some degree from a science communication perspective. Everyone else is going to have access to this information. And if there's no sources that are out there trying to provide nuanced, correct interpretations of the scientific information that is available, people are going to consume what they can, or consume what is easy for them to digest or easy for them to actually apply in a way that they can understand. So filling that hole with something from the author's mouths that actually is the nuanced, but yet actionable scientific interpretation of the work, I think is really, really important. And it's a huge part of this process. So that's the first thing. The second thing I would say is that I only think this is improved if the entire manuscript, the entire set of methods, is publicly available. Tons of times in my specific case for this project, because the entire methods, the entire paper, all of the materials are publicly available, you have essentially moderators of people that have also read the work that can kind of police themselves to some degree. Now, if this is the case where only certain individuals have access, then that becomes less prevalent. So, for example, if there's a misunderstanding, that can be corrected by some individuals in the comments of social media platforms or what have you, because they have access to the entire set of information as well. Obviously, again, it comes back to having some onus probably on the authors and the individuals who are doing the science to have a place to refer people for a scientifically accurate place of interpretation. But I do think, again, pretty much any issue like this is not unique to preprints. And I think having the entire manuscript, methods, data, everything available gives people the ability to police themselves to some degree, and only makes this problem something that we can better perturb.
Additional questions, comments? Cheers, concerns? Well, I don't think we have anything further, so I would just like to say thank you again to Zach for showing his experience and discussing the preprint. I think it's wonderful. Thank you to Dr. Zordos for bringing it to our attention and you know, continuing to support open science and scientific integrity. Not just here at FAU, but everywhere. And if you would like to get in touch with Zach and talk further about this process, or even to read the article, access the article, it's actually quite interesting. I didn't understand a lot of it, but I got the gist, and I did think it was extraordinarily interesting from somebody who does some strength training. I did enjoy it, so thank you. A commoner understood it. So please, you can get in touch with us, or you can contact Zach directly through the FAU Muscle Lab. All right, thanks everyone. Have a great day.